Life. Life in prison. The gavel slammed down with a crack that echoed like gunfire. 17-year-old Malik Carter flinched as the sound reverberated through the dark-paneled courtroom. His wrists were bound in steel, but it was not the cuffs that tightened around him. It was the weight of the word life. His face was still boyish, skin smooth, but his eyes burned like coals in a furnace. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice not to tremble, forcing himself not to scream. "You're looking at my skin to judge me guilty," Malik said. His words low but fierce. "You abused your power. Check my father's name, you'll regret this." For a heartbeat, silence hung like a blade. Then came the reaction. Whispers, murmurs swelling into a tide. The courtroom fractured into camps. Some smirked, satisfied with the verdict. Others gasped in disbelief. At the press benches, journalists scribbled furiously, cameras clicking like insect wings. On the bench, presiding over it all, sat Judge Harold Whitmore, a heavy-set man in his 60s with silver hair combed back to reveal a broad forehead and sharp, cold eyes. For 30 years he had worn the robe as though it were armor, ruling with the confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged. To him, Malik was nothing but another statistic, a young black male caught in violence, his lips pressed into a thin line, unmoved by Malik's words. The chamber itself seemed to bear down on Malik. High walls paneled in dark mahogany, the national seal hanging over the judge's head, as if declaring the verdict sacred. Sunlight filtered in through the tall windows at an angle, slicing the air into sharp beams that illuminated the dust motes swirling above the boy's bowed head. At the jury box, whispers crept like snakes. Several jurors glanced at Malik with disdain, as if his protest confirmed their assumptions. Others avoided his eyes altogether. Among the rows of spectators, classmates from school clustered together, murmuring. A girl shook her head, muttering, "He's still delusional." Another leaned in, whispering, "That black kid was always trouble. He deserves life." A boy with acne scars smirked. He swore he'd get back at Brandon. Everybody heard him. The victim's name hung unspoken but heavy in the air. Brandon Hayes. White. Well liked, at least by those who never saw his cruelty. Malik clenched his jaw. Yes, he had punched Brandon once, in front of everyone, after being taunted, shoved, and called names that seared into him like acid. Everyone remembered the punch. No one remembered the slurs. When Brandon turned up dead after a fight, suspicion had traveled in a straight line, arrow sharp, pointing at Malik. Wait a second. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us. The cameras clicked faster. One reporter mouthed the headline already forming. Black teen convicted of classmate's murder, sentenced to life. Malik's mother sat in the back row, her frame trembling, shoulders hunched as though she could fold herself into the bench. Angela Carter, black, a nurse, pressed a crumpled tissue to her mouth to stifle sobs. When she tried to move closer, to reach for her son, an usher shoved her back. Someone hissed in her ear, "Your boy's a killer." She wept harder, but her eyes never left Malik. On the bench opposite, the jury foreman gathered his papers, expression blank. To him it was done. To Malik it was only beginning. Malik straightened as the bailiff stepped forward to lead him away. He fought to keep his chin lifted, his shoulders squared. Inside, fury and fear coiled together. But he clung to a single thought. I didn't do this. The truth will come out. The bailiff gripped his arm. Behind them, two uniformed officers muttered under their breath.
Another black kid headed to prison.
One chuckled.
Nothing new under the sun.
Malik heard them, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he locked his eyes on Judge Whitmore, the robe-draped figure looming above him. You think you've buried me, he whispered, voice too low for most to hear. But you've made a mistake you'll never escape. The judge's gaze shifted, just for a moment, toward the front row, where his own son sat. Thomas Whitmore, 18, blonde-haired, clean-cut, wearing his private school blazer, his posture radiating confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had been Brandon's closest friend. He had been Malik's classmate. Now he sat with arms folded, expression unreadable, while his father's eyes lingered with something like triumph. The bailiff tugged Malik forward. From the gallery came more whispers, louder now. He was violent. Everyone knew. He swore revenge. Of course he did it. Reporters raised their cameras again, shutters firing in rhythm, recording every step of the boy in shackles. Each flash declared him guilty before the world. Malik inhaled through his nose, forcing calm. Each breath was a vow. I won't break. I won't give them the satisfaction. But the injustice seared deeper with each step. He passed classmates who recoiled, teachers who shook their heads with weary disappointment, former friends who whispered slurs under their breath, calling him delusional, saying he deserved life. Every murmur was a knife, yet every knife only sharpened his resolve. As the doors of the courtroom swung open and the bailiff guided him into the corridor, Malik leaned closer, his words a vow carried in a whisper. They think they've won, but I won't fall. They've made a mistake too big to hide. Behind him, the chamber returned to its rhythm, voices buzzing, pens scratching, cameras flashing. To most, the story was over. Another conviction, another headline, another young black life discarded. But to Malik Carter, it was only the opening move. The verdict echoed long after the gavel's last strike. For most in the courtroom, it was oversigned, sealed, done. For Malik Carter, it was the beginning of a new trial, the court of whispers, judgments, and rumors that followed him out the door. To understand how the world saw him, you only had to listen. Malik was smart, said Gerald Simmons, his former history teacher, in a voice that carried both disappointment and resignation. Simmons, a wiry man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a permanent frown etched into his brow, had watched Malik from the back row of the trial. Bright kid, but hot-headed. He let his temper get the best of him. I warned him more than once. Anger closes doors. His words spread through the hall like ink in water, staining perception. Among students, the testimony was harsher. A cluster of classmates whispered to a reporter outside the courthouse. One boy said, "He hated Brandon Hayes." Everybody knew it. Another chimed in, "He swore he'd make him pay. I heard him say it." They leaned into the microphones eagerly, as if feeding the narrative gave them a piece of the spotlight. And the press devoured it. Claire Donovan, a sharp-eyed journalist for a local daily, summed it up in a soundbite that hit the evening news. "This is the profile we've seen time and again. Troubled youth from a poor neighborhood. Quick temper, a history of fights. The path from disadvantage to delinquency, and now to a life sentence." Her words crystallized the story into a familiar shape, a ready-made headline, from poverty to prison. In those perspectives, Malik was no longer a boy. They had made him into a cautionary tale. When the bailiffs pulled him toward the door, Malik walked in silence. His chains rattled with each step. Behind him, the murmurs swelled. Two uniformed officers escorting him exchanged smirks. One muttered just loud enough for Malik to hear. Another black kid off the streets. The other snorted. Nothing changes. Malik kept his head high, his face set like stone, but the words burrowed into him. They don't see me. They only see the color of my skin. Beside him shuffled Robert Klein, the court-appointed defense attorney, a middle-aged man with sagging jowls and tired eyes. Klein carried the case files tucked under his arm as though they were an afterthought. He had barely cross-examined the witnesses, rarely objected, and never raised his voice. To Malik, it had felt less like a defense than a performance done by rote. Klein leaned close now, whispering, "Keep quiet. Don't make it worse." Malik turned to him, eyes blazing. "You never tried to make it better." Klein didn't answer. He just sighed, tugged at his tie, and fell back into silence. In the gallery, Malik's mother, Angela Carter, tried to push forward. Her tears stained her blouse, her face crumpled by grief. "My son is innocent," she cried. But hands shoved her back, voices hissing in her ear. "Your boy is a killer. He'll never come out. Stop defending him. You look pathetic." Angela stumbled, clutched at the wooden bench for balance. But she refused to leave. Her body shook with sobs, but her gaze stayed fixed on Malik, following him until he disappeared through the doors. Not everyone in the crowd believed the verdict. At the far edge of the courtroom sat Devin Brooks, Malik's closest friend since middle school. Devin, 16, lanky with a nervous energy that kept his foot tapping against the floor, had wanted to testify. He knew how Brandon Hayes had tormented Malik for years, shoving him in hallways, mocking his clothes, hurling slurs loud enough for teachers to hear, but soft enough for them to ignore. Devon had even seen Brandon throw the first punch that day in the schoolyard, the fight that became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. He had begged to take the stand, but without hard evidence, his testimony was brushed aside as biased. His silence now felt like betrayal. As Malik was led away, Devon pressed his forehead into his palms. "I should have done more," he whispered. Back in chambers, away from the crowd, Judge Harold Whitmore lingered for a moment before removing his robe. He cast a glance toward the gallery, where his son, Thomas, still sat in his blazer. Their eyes met. The faintest curve of satisfaction touched the judge's lips before he looked away. It was subtle, invisible to most, but Malik caught it. That flicker of triumph, the kind of look a man wears not when justice has been served, but when a plan has succeeded. Malik felt the heat of it burn into him as the bailiff pushed him through the side door. The transfer van waited in the alley behind the courthouse. Its steel doors yawned open, the interior dark, lined with metal benches. Malik climbed in under the guard's shove, his wrists still cuffed, chains clinking. The door slammed shut, drowning him in the echo of iron. The vehicle jolted into motion. Through the barred window, he glimpsed the courthouse receding, reporters shouting into cameras, his mother's small figure lost in the crowd. He leaned back against the cold wall, chains biting into his wrists. His breath came slow and measured. "They think they've won," he whispered into the dim. His voice was steady, stronger than he felt. "But I won't fall. They've made a mistake too big to hide." His words hung in the steel box, a vow only the walls could hear. Outside, the story rolled on. Teachers repeated their warnings about Malik's temper. Classmates repeated his threats. Journalists repeated the familiar script. The narrative was closing in around him like cement setting in a mold. But beneath the headlines and the whispers, another story waited. One Malik could feel pressing at the edges. He didn't know when or how it would surface, only that it had to. And until that day came, he would hold himself upright. Shackled, judged, condemned, but not broken. The transfer van had barely rolled 10 feet out of the courthouse gates when the world around it split open. Sirens wailed, a shrill, rising chorus that grew louder by the second. Engines roared, tires screeched against pavement. Out of nowhere, a caravan of black SUVs swept into the courtyard, their federal license plates glinting under the midday sun. The driver of the van cursed under his breath and slammed on the brakes. Guards reached instinctively for their radios. Inside, Malik Carter braced himself as the vehicle lurched to a stop. Through the barred windows, he saw the doors of the SUVs swing open in unison. Federal agents poured out. They were unmistakable. FBI jackets flashing bold yellow letters, weapons holstered at their sides, their movements crisp and coordinated. The air itself seemed to shift, heavy with authority. What had moments earlier been a routine transfer now felt like the arrival of a storm. At the head of the group walked Elaine Porter, the U.S. attorney for the district. Porter was a woman in her mid-40s, tall and composed, her sharp eyes hidden behind frameless glasses. Known for her exacting standards and unshakable presence, she carried herself with the controlled force of someone who had spent 2 decades prosecuting cases that rattled governments. Her dark suit caught the light as she strode forward, flanked by federal marshals. The courthouse doors flew open again. Bailiffs froze mid-step as Porter and her agents pushed inside, their presence filling the lobby like a sudden downpour. The murmur of reporters outside turned into a roar. Judge Harold Whitmore had barely removed his robe when the doors to his chambers burst open. A marshal stepped inside, followed by Porter. "Judge Whitmore," she said, her voice cold, deliberate. "Proceedings are not finished. There is new evidence." The color drained from Whitmore's face. For the first time that day, his authority faltered. Within minutes, the courtroom that had just emptied was filled again. Jurors were recalled, reporters swarmed back into the press benches, and the spectators returned with a feverish energy, whispering as they waited. Malik was brought back in, still cuffed, his steps heavier than before. He caught sight of his mother in the back row. Angela Carter, her eyes red from crying but now fixed on him with desperate hope. He gave her the smallest nod, as if to say, "Something's about to change." The bailiff guided him to his seat. Cameras clicked wildly. The entire room seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Porter stood in the center, flanked by 2 agents carrying evidence bags. Her voice rang clear across the chamber. "We have obtained new material evidence in the case of the state versus Malik Carter. Evidence that directly implicates another individual." A ripple of shock coursed through the audience. Even the jurors leaned forward. Porter gestured, and one agent lifted a monitor onto the evidence stand. The screen flickered to life. "This," Porter said, "is surveillance footage from a street camera near Westfield Park, the night Brandon Hayes was killed." The video played grainy black and white footage of 2 figures walking down a sidewalk under flickering streetlights. Porter's voice narrated. At 10:42 p.m., Brandon Hayes is seen entering the alleyway. Accompanying him, Thomas Whitmore, son of Judge Harold Whitmore. Gasps erupted from the gallery. All eyes snapped to the front row, where Thomas sat rigid, his face blanching. Porter continued. "This footage was withheld during initial discovery. It was obtained only after a federal review." The agent switched slides. Another bag was lifted onto the table. A bloodied knife, dirt clinging to the hilt. "This weapon," Porter said, her tone cutting, "was recovered yesterday from a vacant lot. Forensic analysis confirms it as the murder weapon. Fingerprint analysis shows partial and complete prints belonging not to Malik Carter, but to Thomas Whitmore." The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, murmurs collided. Reporters shouted into phones, scribbling furiously. Jurors exchanged horrified glances. Judge Whitmore gripped the bench with white knuckles. His lips moved as if to speak, but no words came. And Porter wasn't finished. She held up another evidence bag, this one containing a shattered phone. "This is Brandon Hayes' phone, retrieved from a drainage canal. Though damaged, the device retained data logs. In the weeks leading up to his death, Brandon received multiple threatening messages." The screen shifted again. Lines of text messages filled the display. "You'll pay for what you did. You think no one sees, but I do. Meet me tonight." Porter's voice hardened. "Every one of these messages traces back to an IP address belonging to the Whitmore residence, more specifically, to the laptop assigned to Thomas Whitmore." The chamber fell into stunned silence. "This evidence establishes beyond doubt that the true perpetrator was not Malik Carter," Porter declared. "It was Thomas Whitmore, and further there is credible indication that Judge Whitmore acted to suppress or bury this evidence, constructing a false narrative to direct blame toward Carter." The silence broke like glass. Spectators gasped aloud. Jurors sat frozen. The press erupted into a storm of scribbling pens and frantic whispers. Headlines were already writing themselves. Judge's son implicated in classmate's murder. Black teen wrongfully convicted. Evidence exonerates him. Angela Carter pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Not of grief this time, but of stunned relief. Malik sat straighter, his cuffs clinking as his hands tightened into fists. His heart hammered, but his eyes glowed with fierce vindication. He turned his gaze directly to the judge. "You tried to bury me," Malik said, his voice ringing across the courtroom. "To save your son." Every eye swung back to the bench. Judge Whitmore sat frozen, his face ashen. He opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Thomas shot to his feet. "I didn't mean to," he cried, voice cracking. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "I just wanted to scare him. I didn't mean—" His words collapsed into sobs, but the meaning was clear. The courtroom was chaos. Jurors gasped. Reporters shouted questions. The gallery swelled with noise. Porter's hand rose, commanding silence. Then she delivered the final blow. "And there is one more truth this court must hear." She turned, her gaze sweeping the room. "The boy you nearly condemned to life in prison, Malik Carter, is the son of the United States Attorney General." The words detonated like dynamite. The chamber erupted into pandemonium. Spectators leapt to their feet. Journalists shouted into cameras. Jurors gaped. Judge Whitmore sagged back against his bench, his face drained of all color. He knew instantly what this meant. Not only had his scheme collapsed, it had placed him in direct opposition to the highest legal authority in the nation. Malik's expression didn't soften. He tilted his head slightly. his voice dropping to a whisper only he seemed to hear. "Now you see why I told you to check my father's name. You judged only my skin, never the truth. And today the truth has struck you harder than any sentence you could give me." The courtroom was a storm without center. The gallery roared with disbelief. Reporters shouted headlines into live feeds, their voices trembling with the electricity of the twist. Somewhere in the back row, Devin Brooks, Malik's friend, leapt to his feet, cheering through tears. Angela Carter wept openly, clutching her chest as she tried to breathe. At the defense table, Malik sat taller than he had all day. His hands were still bound, but for the first time, the shackles didn't feel like chains. They felt like evidence of how far prejudice had gone, and how far truth could rise. Judge Harold Whitmore stared at his son, who was still sobbing uncontrollably. The proud image of a model youth lay shattered at his feet. The mask of judicial authority crumbled with it. He knew his own reckoning was coming. And Malik, calm amid the chaos, watched it all with a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, the weight shifted, not onto his shoulders but off them. The tide had turned, and the storm was only beginning. The courtroom no longer resembled the chamber of solemn judgment it had been that morning. It was a storm. Voices clashing, reporters shouting into cameras, spectators gasping in disbelief. At the center of it all sat Judge Harold Whitmore, once the embodiment of authority, now trembling in his own chair. The evidence had shattered the illusion. His son's fingerprints on the weapon, his son's messages traced from the family computer. His son caught on camera with Brandon Hayes on the night of the killing, and now the revelation that the boy he had sentenced was the child of the nation's top law officer. Whitmore's body sagged. The gavel, which hours earlier had thundered with false certainty, now lay useless at his side. His face drained of color, his lips trembling as he whispered to no one, "This can't be." But it was. At the defense table, Malik Carter straightened. The cuffs still clinked around his wrists, but his posture was no longer that of the condemned. His shoulders squared, his eyes fierce, his presence undeniable. He looked directly at the bench, voice carrying over the din. "Now do you understand why I told you to check my father's name? You looked only at my skin, never at the truth, and today the truth has spoken for itself." The chamber stilled at his words. For a moment Malik's voice became the only sound that mattered, slicing through the chaos like a clean blade. On the front bench, Thomas Whitmore collapsed under the weight of exposure. Agents closed in around him, cuffs gleaming. The boy who had been paraded as a model student, a future leader, now wailed as steel locked around his wrists. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed, his voice echoing off the walls. "I just wanted to scare him. I didn't mean to." His words broke apart into hysterical cries as he was pulled to his feet. The contrast was searing. One boy, black, condemned, nearly buried alive by a verdict built on prejudice. The other, white, protected, his guilt hidden by the robes of his father. And now both stood revealed. One as an innocent wronged, the other as a guilty son shielded by corruption. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines rewriting themselves in real time. Judge's son arrested for classmate's murder. Black teen wrongly convicted, vindicated in courtroom twist. The jurors, who only hours before had whispered about Malik's anger, now sat pale and silent, confronted by the collapse of the story they had believed. Angela Carter, Malik's mother, could no longer hold back. She rose from the back row, her sobs breaking into cries of relief. As Malik was uncuffed, she rushed forward. The two collided in the center aisle, mother and son clinging to one another, their tears mingling as cameras flashed around them. Within days, the consequences spread like cracks through glass. Judge Harold Whitmore was suspended from the bench pending investigation. The charges against him, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress evidence, abuse of power, were listed in headlines that once carried only his rulings. His name, once spoken with deference, became shorthand for betrayal. Thomas Whitmore was indicted on charges of manslaughter and criminal threats. Gone was the image of the golden boy. In its place, mugshots circulated, his tear-streaked face plastered across every news outlet. The witnesses who had shaded their testimony, the journalists who had written Malik into a stereotype, now faced public outrage. their credibility fractured. Letters poured into editorial boards, social media seared their words into memory, demanding accountability. And Malik? For Malik, vindication came not in the punishment of others, but in the freedom to step outside the courthouse doors without chains. He emerged into the sunlight with his mother's arm looped through his, cameras crowding the steps, microphones extended in every direction. For a moment, the roar of voices pressed against him. Then he lifted his chin, let his eyes scan the sea of lenses, and spoke. "I almost lost my life to prejudice," he said, his voice steady though his chest heaved with emotion. "I hope from today forward justice will not care who your father is, but only what the truth is." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some wept openly. Reporters shouted for more, but Malik didn't linger. He wrapped his arm more tightly around his mother, guiding her down the steps as if shielding her from the crush of attention. Together they walked into the blaze of afternoon light. The story refused to fade. Clips of Malik's words spread nationwide, taught in classrooms, replayed in news specials, dissected in op-eds. His face, once splashed across front pages as a troubled youth, was now framed as the face of resilience, dignity, and defiance. Judge Whitmore spent his days answering subpoenas, stripped of the black robe that had shielded his arrogance. His name, once carved into the wood of authority, now appeared only in indictments. Thomas Whitmore awaited trial, his sobs recorded forever in the footage of that courtroom collapse. His cries, "I didn't mean to," became the haunting counterpoint to Malik's steady declaration of truth. And then, at a press conference held on the steps of the Department of Justice, Attorney General Robert Carter stood beside his son, a tall, commanding figure with salt and pepper hair, and the calm authority of decades in law. He placed his hand firmly on Malik's shoulder. His voice carried across the nation. "No child should be condemned by prejudice. My son's case is not just about my family. It is about every family that fears the scales of justice are weighted against them." Malik himself found no instant peace. Injustice leaves scars, even when overturned. But with his father's hand steady on his shoulder and his mother's arm wrapped protectively around him, he held his head high. To the public he became a symbol. To Angela Carter, he was her son returned, and to the Attorney General he was living proof that even the highest office must bow before the truth. And to every child who had ever been told they were guilty by default, Malik stood as proof. Truth can rise, even when buried deep beneath prejudice. From a condemned criminal, he had become something more enduring, an emblem of justice reclaimed, and of hope for those still waiting to be seen. Messenger. Sometimes the most powerful gavel is not the one struck from the bench, but the voice that refuses to be silenced. Malik Carter's story showed us how easily truth can be buried under prejudice and how costly that silence nearly became. Yet when the storm broke, the truth rose, not only to clear his name, but to expose corruption at the highest levels. And when Malik stood beside his father, the U.S. Attorney General, it was more than a family's vindication, it was a nation's reminder. Justice cannot serve power, it must serve truth. The question left for us is this: will we keep demanding that kind of justice until no child's future is defined by color instead of character?